Right, hello one and all. I thought the other day, we had to do a little run out to a local cafe just to meet somebody for a coffee, and the weather was good, so my cousin and I both decided that we would ride our old BSAs out there. His is a C11, C12 I think, mine's B40 obviously, and we had it was a bit cool, but we got on the bikes, rolled out and dodged any rain and had a great little run out there. Stopped on the way back as we parted company in a place called Caversham. I live to the west and he lives to the east of Reading, so we stopped there and we had a chat and basically a giggle because we were both grinning like school children. We just had just good fun riding them. It's all sort of 50-mile-an-hour roads. We managed to sort of maintain about 50 miles an hour most of the way, even 60. It was so we weren't holding traffic up, and it was a great giggle. But it gave me pause to think, having watched a lot of YouTube nonsense and reviews of course, the latest incarnations of the 350 engine, which I'm very impressed with actually. Balance of shafts, the quality looks good, and the classics and indeed the new Hunter look to be very nice packages. And part of me at sort of some point in time, whilst I was musing these things with a cup of coffee, thought, oh yeah, I wouldn't mind one of those. But this ride out gave me pause to think that I actually already had that. Now, I'm not saying that a 1965, or in my cousin's case, a 1958 motorcycle is anything as usable on a modern road, but it just gave me pause to think, what is the comparison between these two? 50 years apart, I don't know, however many years apart they are, 63 in the case of the C12, and yeah, you think, well, let's have a sort of a look and a comparison and see where it sits. So this is what we've done from here on. Right, for the purposes of comparison, as I say, we'll use the Royal Enfield Classic 350, which really is a very similar looking machine. Obviously designed to be period, but a modern iteration, I think is the word. So, forgive me for reading off the specs, but I've had a look at these. Now some of the specs are going to be a bit according to the various Wikipedia or Google searches, but they should be about right. So in no particular order, BSA compression ratio 7:1, Royal Enfield 9.5:1, BSA power 21 horsepower, Royal Enfield power 20.2 horsepower. We haven't got a figure for torque for the BSA. It wasn't even a thing back in the day. Everybody measured the power on the amount of horsepower it had. But the torque on the Royal Enfield is 19.9 foot-pounds. Obviously the BSA has a 4-speed gearbox, the Royal Enfield a 5-speed gearbox. Brakes, always going to be a weak point on the older bike. 7-inch front drum with a leading shoe and a 6-inch rear. On the Royal Enfield, 300mm disc on the front, 270 on the rear. I haven't managed to find a rake figure for the steering on the Royal Enfield, but the rake on the BSA is 65 degrees. It's not overly important. The wheelbase, almost identical on the bikes, 54 inches on the BSA, 54.7 inches on the Royal Enfield. Forgive me for these mixing millimeters with inches, but it's just as I found them. The seat height on the BSA 32 inches, on the Royal Enfield 31.7. The BSA has got a dual seat, one-piece dual seat, whereas the Royal Enfield's got this two-piece seat, but it has a remarkably comfortable looking single saddle for the front. On the BSA, 18 inches the wheels, front and rear. I think the C15s were maybe 17 inches. I think they're different. Anyway, on the BSA B40, 18-inch wheels, On the Royal Enfield, a 19-inch front and an 18-inch rear. Ground clearance, again this is quite remarkably similar, 7 inches on the BSA and 6.7 inches on the Royal Enfield. The interesting one is the weight. It's showing, as far as I can see, 165 kilograms wet on the BSA and 295 pounds dry. I'll work that out in a minute. But you can work that out for yourselves, I'm sure, if you read specifications on Google. 195 kilograms wet weight on the Royal Enfield. I would guess, bearing in mind that back in the day, people were a lot more, let's say, not quite so sort of accurate with the truth. Sometimes they would weigh things with bits missing. I would say they should be fairly compatible weight-wise. 3 gallons of fuel on the BSA. I think there's slightly more on the Royal Enfield. I haven't got a figure for that. Obviously the BSA has a dry sump. Obviously that means there's an oil tank on the side of the bike. There's an oil tank that feeds into the engine, whereas the Royal Enfield is all within the engine. The BSA is just overhead valve with a kickstart. Of course the Royal Enfield has a electric start. Bore and stroke, again relatively similar. BSA bore and stroke 79 by 70 millimeters. On the Royal Enfield 72 by 85 millimeters. So that's a slight difference, I suppose you could say. The BSA is a 6 volt, unless you get these the WD ones. But the BSA, what they call the BSA Star, we'd call it the cooking model. The normal model that the man would have ridden to work would have been a 6 volt, and the Royal Enfield obviously is a 12 volt. BSA's got a carburetor, of course. The Royal Enfield's fuel injected, and in terms of like, that's really referring to the usefulness of it. The BSA has got a rear brake light only, whereas of course the Royal Enfield's got brake light front and rear, and of course ABS. There is a torque figure for the Royal Enfield I found here of 19.9 foot-pounds. So yeah, it's remarkably similar. Say 50 years apart, well, something like 50, getting on 50 years apart. Remarkably similar. So when we're looking at riding them, of course, if you ride a modern Royal Enfield, let's shut that over there, it's far more usable in traffic. If people of no mechanical aptitude think, oh, well, I'll buy a BSA B40, I would suggest, no, I'd buy the Royal Enfield. It's going to be very much more usable. Lights, 6 volt lights are candles compared with what the modern motorcycle is running on. And again, the ease of use of the clutch, the engine on the older machines, any old machine of the sort of 60s era, it's all a bit sort of, everything's an adventure when you ride it, including whether it will start, keep going, run, break down, pee out oil or petrol or whatever. So yeah, it's an interesting comparison. Obviously, having done that comparison, I don't feel there's any, obviously from my point of view, there's no point in even thinking about the Royal Enfield Classic. It is a comparable modern machine to it, but in terms of power, surprisingly, not dissimilar to the BSA B40. What I would say in defence of the Royal Enfield, obviously a modern engine with a balancer shaft, you could run that at near flat out, I'll say all day long. Do that on a BSA and it's not going to be, it's not going to last too long. I think the sort of manual said the cruising speed is 55 miles an hour, and once you get above that 55 miles an hour, or even at it, it's got quite a lot of vibration, and yeah, you can wind it up. It will do 70, 75, I think it was, which is again is about compatible, I think, with the Royal Enfield, but it's not a nice experience, and you know you're inflicting pain on the thing, and So you tend to sort of potter around 50 miles an hour as its happy place, 50, 60, and you know you're starting to push on a bit. If you crack the throttle open at 60, it gives a roar, and but that's about all it gives. It just gives a gentle pull. As I say, it will do faster. I have done faster, but it's not a kind thing to do to it. So it's an interesting comparison how in those many years the engine, despite its higher compression ratio, is still relatively under-stressed on the Royal Enfield. I'm quite surprised that they've only got that much power out of it. It's obviously a very soft tune. Probably, again, look at the market, whether a huge amount of them are sold in India, in its various guises, and I'm sure the little Hunter will be selling like hotcakes over there because that's to them a big full-size motorcycle. And the abuse that those get, and I think that's a bike that they've designed the engine so as it can be ridden pretty much on the throttle stop. And well, what we'd term, if it were BSA, you'd term it abuse, but I think it's a bike that's able to be ridden. So yes, they're compatible as in looks and style of bike. In terms of braking, handling, suspension, etc., etc., the Royal Enfield's going to be a quantum leap. But it's interesting that as the years that have gone past, the Royal Enfield have suddenly come out of the woods with a reincarnation of 50, 60-year-old, probably more than that actually, if you look at the original Bullet motorcycle, and completely caught the other manufacturers with their pants down. I think it's quite humorous because I'm sure it's surprised them, some of them, as much as it surprised anybody else that the UK has embraced these little 350s that struggle to do the national speed limit, and they really have gone well. The sales seem to be right up there among best sellers, and of course for I think somewhere between £4.5 and £5, depending on specification, and there's various new models coming out in the military colours and what have you. All very nice, and yes, if you wanted that sort of machine, just go around the lanes, fantastic piece of kit for the money. I literally thought a little while ago, I thought, oh, maybe I'd trade my Triumph in. And when I started looking at how much they'd give me for the Triumph, I thought, ooh, that's a bit of a kicking. It's only got I don't think it's got 15,000 miles on it yet, full service history and everything. And I thought, well, hang on a second. To be honest, I could keep this, because whatever you're going to buy, you're probably going to put £5 to, and if not more, if you want something a bit more exotic. But if you suddenly think, well, hang on a second, if I did only have the Triumph and none of the other bikes, I think I would say, well, do you know what? I'm not going to trade the Triumph. I'll just keep that for touring and distance, and buy a Hunter or even a Classic. If I didn't have the BSA, maybe I'd go for the Classic. But so that's it. A very interesting comparison, and I sort of looked at the power figures and thought, bloody hell, you know, I've got that in a, to me, more desirable package, because I've had it for 30 something years. Yeah, I can't remember even when I bought it, but I've had it for a long time, so I'll just keep it and run it. It's only done 7,000 miles. If you look at the pictures, you'll see that it's got rear racks on it. It's actually, although it's a BSA B40, what they call a Star, B40 Star was the designation. It's the 65 one, which has got the points in the side of the engine, which is supposed to be makes it a bit easier, I don't know. It has, it's a civil defence procurement. I may have spoken about this before, but basically it's when the government were in cahoots with industry and trying to keep industry afloat, and they ordered a whole batch of motorcycles. And for those in the UK that remember something called the Green Goddess fire engines, all of these vehicles were bought with the, I suppose, the scaremongering of nuclear war, and the idea was that these people would be going around on motorcycles and lorries when all other forms of, I suppose, governmental organisation had collapsed and the army was in control. As it was, the Green Goddesses got their use in the great strike of, I don't know when, but I barely remember that. But the bikes were bought with the same intention. So it actually would have been an auxiliary fire service machine. It would not have had the BSA star on the tank. It would have had a little red decal, just probably hand painted where the flat is for the star decal. It would just have said AFS, auxiliary fire service. And I believe, I've only ever seen a picture of one once, a brass fire extinguisher fitted somewhere. The panniers on the back would have carried, I don't know what, you can put, it actually fits perfectly on there. I've got a 1945 jerry can, that fits perfectly on there. Whether they'd be going around with jerry cans on the back, I don't know. Maybe they did, that was the intention. I've also got some military, I suppose, well, they came in bags, brand spanking new, but stamped up 1945 canvas bags, which were obviously significantly older than the motorcycle. But those sort of, yeah, you could strap those on the back, and they're, again, perfect fit. I've actually got them on the back. I don't know whether I've put any pictures on there, but I've got some cardboard in them just to make them look square, but basically they would have just been on the back all sort of flat. I tend to take them off if the weather looks anything other than perfect, because they still look virtually brand new. So getting them splashed with mud might look authentic, but I'm trying to save them and keep them. I don't know who for, because at the end of the day, when I'm gone, the bike will only pass on to somebody else. But it's a sweet little machine, 7,000 miles on it now. It probably only had 2 or 3 on it when I bought it, and it was an old fella who'd had it as a go-to-work bike. Gotten to the age, probably, my age or a little bit more, and fallen off it and decided bugger that. The only thing that's not original on it, the tank was painted because it had a dent in it. It's like a Land Rover green. It is literally, I think it is literally Land Rover green. It is shiny, not matte. And I replaced, obviously, cables and rubbers and what have you replace. And I replaced the carburetor a couple of years ago because it started sticking, and after a lot of flipping moaning and experimenting, the carburetor body was distorted, so it's obviously maybe been pinched up too tight or something, but it's got a new carburetor on there now, so it runs sweet as a nut. And it's probably had more oil changes than the chip pan. Not that we've got a chip pan, but as the saying goes. It just sits in the garage from one trip to the next. It gets a bit of a clean here and there. I'm not cleaned too much lately. I've let the oil sit on it, although it's not sitting on it too much, so maybe it needs a bit of a spray over before the winter really kicks in. So my recommendation to anybody who's sitting there thinking, oh, I really fancy a classic motorcycle, unless you really are a nuts and bolts man and prepared to get out there and spend hours faffing around, then realistically, unless you can buy a mint one like mine, say it's mint, but an original one that is actually in working order, and even then, you could end up blowing the bottom end out of it at any time. We were going up hills at 55, 60 miles an hour, downhill, 60, and sort of like cracked the throttle a couple of times. You could have just blown the bottom end out of it, and it was like flipping out. Back to basics, another one, you'd have to take it out, rebuild it, and go through the whole sort of motions, all of which can be done. But the ideal, if you just want to ride a classic machine, get yourself a Royal Enfield. It's ridiculous. Probably about the same value, I would guess. I think probably about the same value. To buy a decent B40, certainly from a dealer, you'd be looking at the same money. So common sense says to me, get something you could just ride, use and enjoy, and get the enjoyment out of riding it. I personally prefer riding them to fixing them. Although saying that, I've spent far too much time fixing bikes in the last 5 or 6 years. If you can just grab yourself a Royal Enfield with 2 years warranty, electric start, 12 volt lights, you drive it to Scotland. It's going to go on and on. It's not going to be a motorway bike any more than the B40 is, but probably a little bit more. I wouldn't be stressed about taking a Royal Enfield into London or to Scotland. The B40, it would be one hell of an adventure, and you'd probably want a Sprinter van somewhere sort of 10 miles behind you all the time, because if it goes wrong or water gets in or whatever, none of which it's ever done, but you can bet sod's law would probably end up with big ends decimated or something on the Pennines, which you would not have to worry about on the Royal Enfield. But there you are. My cousin's bike, which you'll see in the picture, it's a C12, I think. It's a 250. Slightly less power, but not a great deal less. It's like the B40 was never a powerful bike. There were other models. I think the SS90 gave about another 5 brake horsepower. And of course, people, twin shock trials and stuff like that, sort of, there's people that tune them, I'm sure. But you can dig into that as you wish. But there you go. So have a think on that. Cheers.